Just give it a couple. I think this might be. I'm trying to think of how much more time to give it before starting. I think the numbers are still kind of going up a little bit, so I'll maybe another minute.
I'm in no rush. You don't control whether or not guests are muted, right?
Um, we can, yes.
Now, I mean, you aren't. You're more so you're going to be looking in the chat at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I think go ahead. Get started. So, everyone who's here, thank you so much for coming. On behalf of thank you so much on behalf of the SEICHE Center. As it is right now, you all are muted at the moment, and then as things go along, we can put questions in the chat and can unmute if necessary. So that's just how the like logistical flow of things go. So as we get started here, I'd just like to start with a thank you for the co-sponsors for this seminar, the Department of African American Studies at Yale, Yale School of Medicine Office of Communications, and Yale University Library. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Professor John Eason, who's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a member of UV's inaugural Center for Diversity and Innovation's Distinguished Visiting Scholar Cohort. Before entering graduate school, he's a church-based community organizer focused on housing and criminal justice issues. Now his research interests challenges existing models and develops new theories of community, health, race, punishment, and rural-urban process in several ways. By tracing the emergence of the rural ghetto, he establishes a new conceptual model of rural neighborhoods. These relationships are explored throughout his book, Big House on the Prairie, Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation. And so with that, we'll be hearing a talk today entitled In Our Backyard, How the Prison Boom Transformed America. And before getting started with that, if we could just take a moment here and do a small check-in on how people are doing in light of everything going on with the trial and shootings and COVID, and this just being a really stressful time. You can, if you're comfortable, you can put it in the chat, like, am I taking care of myself right now? Am I showering? Am I doing okay? If that's something that you're comfortable doing, just take a moment and reflect on that. Yeah, it's definitely been a hard time, and I really thank you all for sharing. And yeah, just taking this moment to check in because it's important for us all to process how things are going. And with that, I think I'd like to hand it over to our speaker today, Professor Eason. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all for sharing in the chat. I've been doing this as I give talks as well as I teach. I give a whole battery of 3 or 4 questions and I do an anonymous poll just to check in on folks because I think it's if we don't acknowledge why we're actually meeting this way, I think it makes it even weirder that we're meeting this way, right? That people have their, people routinely going to meetings now with cameras off and everything else for a whole variety of reasons. But as an ethnographer who uses quantitative and mixed methods, I always like to think about positionality. And so I'm going to start my talk from that, from explaining a little bit of positionality. And I'm going to, let me share my screen. This is always an interesting process to make sure the right screen is up. Callie, please let me know if.
All right. We're not quite seeing your slides yet.
There
And
it
there
is.
they
Okay.
are. Perfect.
Okay. So it is an honor and indeed a pleasure to have this opportunity to present here to you today. I'd like to thank the students and faculty who put this together, put this spring seminar series together, and who invited me in. Given my title talk, which is dealing with my second book on this topic, I'm in the middle of doing a series of analyses, different types of quantitative analyses that build off of the theories from that I introduced in my first book. And some of more and more of my work is moving into public health, or health broadly speaking, access to healthcare and the like. So what I wanted to do, I'm going to start by talking about giving a bridge between my first book and second book. Then I'm going to do a little bit of a detour to talk about some work I'm doing on COVID as well. So I want to start from my own position as well to let you all know the only line I feel great about with this book right now. The quantitative analyses are all fine. I'm doing a little bit of historical deep dive as well. But the only line that I know I'm keeping in the book, I start with my own position. And what for in our backyards, I start with this line. I was not born in jail, but I grew up in the shadow of the prison and the asylum. And I give more of my family history after this in the book to start off the book to explain why not just so many Americans, because over 60%, I'll show this slide a little bit later, over 60% of Americans know someone who is jailed, but over 80% of African Americans know someone who has been jailed. And I grew up in that world, and I understand that. So with that in mind, in our backyard is not only the title of the talk, but also the book I'm working on. In this book, I'm reframing the "please in my backyard" question, PIMBY question I posed in Big House on the Prairie, by offering new theories of prison building using data on all U.S. Census places and every prison constructed in the U.S. to investigate the mechanisms causing prison building, along with the multiple and often conflicting ways prisons impact the political economy of local towns, counties, and states. And so by expanding the scope and scale of prison building, this inquiry will serve in defining one of the most pressing social problems of our time: prison proliferation, or the widespread expansion of prisons. In Our Backyard binds the legacy of slavery and the racial violence of Jim Crow to the modern political economy of underdevelopment in the rural South. While the power of past systems of racial domination and violence are salient, they cannot solely account for the U.S. tripling our prison facilities in such short order. Instead, I offer the rural ghetto, born out of the historical legacy of racial violence, as the modern incarnation of oppression in the rural South. Our Backyard will demonstrate how the rise of the rural ghetto, concentrated poverty, residential segregation, and stigma provide a powerful impetus for local prison building across the U.S. So, despite the growing significance of prison reform that occasionally bubbles up, like in the presidential debates, and even now you'll see more stuff coming out as Biden finishes his first 100 days in office, recommendations around prison reform. The potential for reform still seems insurmountable, even with the prison population dropping given the scale of incarceration. I think we just made it, we just dipped over under 2 million, under 2 million persons, but there's still roughly 2 million people incarcerated in this country. So the scale of incarceration, the extensive and entrenched system of monetary sanctions, which will undoubtedly capture more people capture more people up in the prison system, mass supervision or the supervised society. So while we have roughly 2 million people in prisons and jails, there's so many more who are under supervision. Some estimates as high as 8 million people annually are on probation, parole, and the like. And the footprint of our system, the fact that our carceral capacity, what Heather Schoenfeld defines as the resources dedicated to detecting, apprehending, processing, and punishing people who are deemed criminal, given the fact that we have over 1,600 facilities, our carceral capacity, our ability to punish is unprecedented in the US. So in my search for a glimmer of hope to look at how we reduce our over-reliance on mass incarceration, and even amidst these calls to abolish the police, that's partly what we're dealing with now. That's born out of abolition movements that were based in prison abolition, and abolition for prisons the prison abolitionist movement is, is an interesting provocation that harkens back to slavery, right? The move to abolish slavery. So with all of that context going on, what I'm going to try and do is nuance and complicate it a little bit for you to see the difficulty in defining prisons and leveling mass incarceration and prison building is one thing, and also leveling these is the same type of racial, the same exact racial systems of racial oppression. And I started this in this public piece that appeared in Dissent in fall of 2019. And I found a glimmer of hope as I use one of my key informants from Forest City, Arkansas, John Alderson, where he argues if we could cite a high-tech, non-polluting facility that pays $100,000 a year instead of a prison, we would have. Heck, I've got the land to sell it to them, but those facilities weren't exactly lining up to come to places like Forest City. So my presentation today is a compilation of these pieces from my book to this public-facing work I've been doing recently. And I may give you a patina of a quantitative analysis for In Our Backyard, but I'm really going to focus on COVID and confined spaces in the second half of this. So prison construction requires more than concrete and stone. And given the history and economic exploitation of this peculiar institution, some are convinced blood and bodies form the bedrock, making prisons the ultimate form of racial and economic exploitation in the US. Many are certain prison building is a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. And this view is supported in part by the exponential increase in US corrections over the past 5 decades. The standard story explaining prison proliferation is that private prison operators hold perverse incentives to increase mass incarceration for profit. Part of what clouds our view of prison building is the farm at Angola. This is a former slave plantation that is now operated as a prison. This is a state-owned and operated prison in Louisiana that is used to symbolize what is wrong with private prisons. Again, this is a state-owned, I'm emphasizing that. It is owned by the state of Louisiana. It is operated by the state of Louisiana. And we use the farm to talk about what is wrong with private prisons. Now, I can't exactly be mad at this confusion, right? There's a piece in Time from 1977, pictured here. It's called The True History of American Private Prison Industry. And even back then, this imagery of inmates at Louisiana State Prison in Angola were being marched down a dusty trail. This looks like, right? You got one white guy in there, but you got one white guy who's being marched along with an otherwise completely black population. This harkens back to images of slavery. This is a completely this picture is more recent. It's from 2016. It appears in the San Francisco Bay View. It's Angola prisoners again, all black, being marched down a dusty road with a white dude on a horse. This harkens back to days of slavery, right? Building from the work of L.B. Eason, I addressed the issue of private prisons versus privatization. Privatization is something completely different. You can see this piece in the conversation. It was also picked up by Salon and the Chicago Tribune and a few other outlets. And so while discursive connections can be useful for advocacy or developing macro theory, inspiring broad theories of change, empirical links will prove most vital for durable theory and sound policy. Is a critical step towards decarceration. I'm investigating the political economy of places related to building public and private prisons. And the same profit motives driving prison privatization are also believed to be the impetus behind the prison boom or the tripling of US facilities since 1970. Given this proliferation during the purported post-racial era, there's a consensus that the modern prison is interchangeable with other forms of racial oppression like slavery, Jim Crow, and convict leasing. However, or I should say, Brian Stevenson, pictured here, who is arguably a modern civil rights leader and inspiration behind the blockbuster film Just Mercy. He claims that slavery didn't end, it just evolves. Stevenson has personally overturned 135 wrongful convictions, freeing scores of innocent people and innocent poor and people of color from the clutches of death row. Despite his accomplishments, his claim of slavery not ending cannot be taken lightly. And given his accomplishments, not despite, given his accomplishments, his claim of slavery not ending cannot be taken lightly, let alone dismissed out of hand. And so while I agree with the sentiment and tone of his righteous anger explicit in his claim, in many ways, this type of thinking denies the victorious social movements of Black folks against past racial systems like slavery and Jim Crow. Victories that can be used as examples of high level of coordination, of collective action, and of fortitude needed to muster the perseverance to end the carceral state, mass incarceration in all its other forms. And as a community and political organizer for then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama on the South Side, I also held the view that prison building was a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. However, as I relocated my family to rural Arkansas to uncover why rural communities were increasingly demanding prisons, I would be disavowed of this notion. This view of prison building is rooted in urban northern bias, rendering rural places powerless, especially communities of color. Prison building is a complex process, complicating much of what we understand about the political, social, and economic life of rural communities. I came to learn this soon after meeting folks like the late, great Cecil Twilley, pictured here. He was a proud man who always had a glimmer in his eye, as if he knew something you didn't, and he was itching to tell you, but only if you asked very nicely. Coach was a pioneer in Forest City, Arkansas, and the Mississippi Delta at large. He integrated the public schools. He was the last, he integrated the local school board, I should say, and administration. He was the first Black member of the local country club, the first Black head coach of the high school after desegregation of public schools, and the last high school football coach in Forest City to win the Arkansas State Championship nearly 50 years ago. This feat is why he was still known as coach in the predominantly black town, uh, predominantly black southern rural town of 14,863. Forest City is also home to about 1,900 prisoners located at the Forest City Federal Correctional Facility. This was constructed in 1997. Contrary to popular belief, my first paper in 2010 demonstrates that towns with higher poverty rates, Black and Latinx populations, are more likely to build a prison. As an early supporter of the prison, Coach elucidates why he welcomed a hideously stigmatized institution like a prison when he explained, "I don't want my town to end up like Gary." During the 1990s, Gary, Indiana became the butt of many jokes as it competed annually for the infamous title of U.S. murder capital. This picture is downtown Gary around 2006. Please note that the Jackson Five were still playing at the Palace that night in 2006. So some of you may not get, I'm dating myself, some of you may not get that, but you can ask about it in Q&A if you don't. This is Forest City around that same time, right? And like Gary, this is downtown Forest City, a picture of downtown Forest City. And like Gary and countless other deindustrializing American cities, Forest City faced racial stigma and uneven development. And recalling life before the prison, one resident notes that several plants and other major employers were closing, and he described things as tough, just tough. Coach's quip about trying to keep his town from ending up like Gary is a way to frame the prison as a means of saving Forest City's reputation. This comparison of Forest City to Gary indicates the town's downward trajectory because of the rise of the rural ghetto. Coach's quip also offers a counterintuitive insight about why rural communities that used to respond with "not in my backyard" or NIMBY to prisons now say PIMBY or "please in my backyard." Site fights or debates over community opposition in support of these facilities with harmful environmental effects have been documented by scholars such as Bob Bullard, who advocate for policies to reverse climate change. As I argue in my first book, Big House on the Prairie, Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation, covering stigma, trying to manage stigma specifically from the rise of the rural ghetto was essential to a reputation management strategy driving the campaign to win the placement of the prison in Forest City. And this is a model based on that ethnographic research. And Coach's, which goes along with Coach's response, demonstrating the agency of middlemen, Black leaders operating between what Mary Patillo labels as the man and the little man. These Black leaders, these middlemen, partnered with the white elites, the 10 people in most rural towns that own about 50% of the land, the 10 families. And pictured here is the structure of that local economy. Coach was not the only one. The future mayor, then city council rep, and president of the local NAACP chapter, Larry Bryant, also supported prison development, as did Andre Stevenson, pictured here. He's the director of the local NGO, the St. Francis County Community Development Corporation. And he said he supported the prison because he believed that a prison beat the hell out of a paper mill. Desperate towns seeking industries to help stabilize their economies like Forest City are not blessed with a wealth of options. So they choose the prison as the best of the worst options available. And you can see stigma not only is in this model, I'm showing how stigma from the rural ghetto drives a growth coalition that seeks out a prison and manage the downward trajectory of the town. However, the prison is also stigmatized. This graph demonstrates is showing public and private building, but the peak of the prison building boom was around 1995. Texas specifically opened 30 prisons that year by itself. Since then, prison building has dropped off precipitously. And while many believe prison building is overwhelmingly a private venture, only 13% of all US prisons are privately owned and operated. This popular notion of privatization is understandable given the ubiquity of the prison. And as I mentioned in my opening, the United States is unique among countries, rich companies. The United States is unique among rich countries in the world in its level of contemporary incarceration. Even during this drop, there's a massive social change. Mass incarceration over the last 40, 50 years is a massive social change that has reshaped the nature of inequality. In fact, a recent study shows that more than half of all Americans have a family member or know someone in prison. And prison and rural communities are not just not just receivers, disproportionately receivers of prisons, as over 60% are built in rural communities, but they also send prisoners. This is a map of Arkansas showing Black and white. These are Black individual addresses of people who've gone into or returned from the Arkansas Department of Correction by race. Blue is white, yellow is Black. And with all of that said, rural communities simultaneously are suffering from mass incarceration and sending people to prison. But there's also this factor that of the 470,000 corrections officers in 2019, 35% of them were Black. And we built so many prisons since 1970. They occupy a landmass of more than 600 square miles and cost at least $30 billion to build. So this massive public works project has transformed the American countryside virtually unnoticed. And while many believe mass incarceration is distinctly urban Black phenomena, however, since 2000, rural and quite separate white communities are sending people to prison in record numbers. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because I don't know how many sociologists are in the room or GIS people. I do have this ugly map that I can come back to that I love to explain. This is hyper segregation. Red is the number of Black people in town. Blue is the number of white households in town. And those little dots, the bigger dots are housing development. So this is how basically changes in the local political economy shaped the rural ghetto, right? And these changes were driven by folks like John Alderson, who talks about public housing, where he says there's a whole lot of rent subsidies as well as houses. And honestly, truthfully, no one really had a feeling for, or anybody had a handle on it. I'm reading a direct quote, by the way. He has a thick Arkansanian accent as well. It's just one of those things that sort of happened. These people needed housing, so we built it. So this is what I believe can be a major takeaway for public health and health medical students. This shows how context matters. So I'm not calling all communities that get a prison themselves rural ghettos, but there are rural ghettos within these towns. And rural ghettos, you can see, and these matter along racial lines as well. I can get into that more, but basically you have concentrated poverty, high degree of residential segregation. That map I showed, that ugly old map I showed, was illustrative to demonstrate that the hypersegregation is a dissimilarity index of 0.86, which is that is really really segregated, as the map shows. concentrated poverty, residential segregation, stigma, and then a place being between 10 and 50,000 people, having a significant population, because there's variation in rural communities. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, I'm going to call it a duck. And a lot of urban sociologists don't necessarily agree with that. But I think this is a better way of thinking about um, what replaced Jim Crow in the rural South, right? It's the rural ghetto. And this matters for your work as not just as public health or health professionals, because context matters. My colleague here at UW, Amy Kind, has a deprivation index, area deprivation index, which is akin to what I'm pointing out here with the rural ghetto. It's in part based on work by Rob Sampson, who's a sociologist, right? And the context matters. Because we typically, especially in medicine, think about individual level outcomes or national level outcomes, and we don't think about how communities, which drive and shape access to care, matter. So I think I'm gonna do one small thing here. I'm gonna exit. Then I'm gonna give you like a 2-minute presentation on this. I have to get to the right slide. This is an extensive study on COVID in confined space, but I'm gonna give you sort of the main takeaway and then do a Q&A. If I can start, I have to switch to PowerPoint, which is always. This is always put this up because in Dane County, Dane County where I live, where the University of Wisconsin-Madison is located, we actually lost a deputy sheriff to COVID. And one of the things I want to point out is linking COVID to prison building, right? In our local jail, what we did here was give you the takeaway from this. This is the hours of COVID exposure prevented by our local government taking into account what was going to happen with the rise of COVID. And in late February, early March, they dropped the jail population by 30%. And because we lead the country in disproportionate rate of incarceration for African Americans, the state of Wisconsin competes with Vermont every year for this dubious honor. I think we're at 11-1, our rate of incarceration, disproportionate rate. What this did was decarcerating the jail, depopulating the jail. I can get into this in more detail, but it basically, it saved every Black resident in Dane County 36 hours of exposure to COVID. So with that said, I want to leave time. I said 2 minutes on this presentation, and I actually did it. Let me see if I can get out of sharing screen so I can take questions. Did I stop sharing my screen yet? No.
Yeah, you did.
I did. Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was an excellent talk. Definitely. I guess I have, this isn't a specific question, but something I'd like to just hear what your general thoughts on are about in rural areas with when you have the corrections department and police officers knowing most of the people in the community because everyone knows everyone, like how this factors into the rural ghetto when it's different from urban incarceration, where I feel like the people incarcerating people don't directly know who they're doing this to, how it plays out when that impact is seen because everything is so intertwined, how that I guess what your general feelings are about this and how that intersects with how just the nature of incarceration?
So I have a number of colleagues that are doing great work on policing, right? Namely, Forrest Stewart at Stanford, uh, Andrea Boyles, who has a book on Ferguson. She's doing great work on policing, and it's not from, so typically criminologists do it from more of an apologist point of view for the police, but they're doing more critical work on how we police and who we police. And I think that there is urban areas, certain urban areas, the cops do know people more. Actually, I believe Chauvin had several run-ins with George Floyd, for example. I think he was familiar with him. So I think there's this view that everyone in rural areas knows each other, and they do. There is a higher familiarity, but that doesn't mean that they have more of a that they care more about the people. In fact, the paper I was citing, the one that I wrote with Chris Wilderman in the Annals, the piece on Arkansas, the disproportionate rate of incarceration is higher in rural communities than urban, right? That doesn't go along with that reason, right? What you were just saying, as far as people being more familiar, you'd think it would be better outcomes, but they're also just more punitive. That's the other part of it. Rural communities, at least from the analysis I've done on Arkansas, would suggest that rural communities are more punitive, or they're becoming increasingly punitive. We know that more in this state, in Wisconsin, more rural and quite separately, white people are going to prison. And white women, especially in rural communities, are going to jail and prison more often. So this speaks to the punitive nature of rural communities. And that's why I've referenced that there really isn't much on rural policing. We just don't know. No one's done it. There's ethnographies of urban policing, but most of the quantitative studies on policing are about hotspots or the effectiveness of policing, and they aren't done from the community perspective. So there's some things in the chat. I don't think I can manage both, but I hope I sort of changed your question, Callie. I understood what you were trying to ask, but given how much we don't know about rural communities, I don't know if it's fair to assess them in that way.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. I was dancing around what I was thinking of what I was trying to say.
I understood. I understood.
Let's see, I can read out a couple of questions in the chat here. Thank you so much for people putting them in. Please continue to put questions in. So Wanda Kelly Jones asks, for the Black men who return to prison like a revolving door, who also suffer from mental health and substance abuse issues, do they really obtain help inside of prison?
So the issue here is since we decided in the late 60s, early 70s that nothing worked, the rehabilitative ideal of and even we can look at this from the perspective of incarcerated persons, but also the people who are charged with taking care of them. Corrections officers. We've had more and more corrections officers flow into the system. So the potential for these to be humane spaces has diminished because we don't view, there's a high turnover rate with corrections officers, so they're not caring. This goes back sort of to what you were saying, Callie. If you're charged with having someone in your care and you see yourself as a professional, then you are more likely to treat those people with some modicum of respect. When we went to warehousing incarcerated people and taking a warehouse model for those charged with caring for them, the correctional staff, we've seen some really problematic stuff come out of that. So long story short, yeah, prison isn't going to be the best place for mental health. Neither is jail. But the largest mental health provider in the country is in Chicago, my hometown, Cook County Jail. So we've closed a lot of mental health facilities, especially mental health hospitals. So this is a way that we're managing the poor and people who are, and we've done this in our past. There's a piece by Sutton, I'm forgetting his first name, where he talked about the in the late 1800s, there was this huge rise in people going into the asylum, and it's because all of the almshouses and old folks' houses were closing, and they just basically shifted the population into the asylums, right? So we can see that we can see similar things going on here, where we just that space creating humanity in that space is it is done sometimes, but it's few and far between. I don't think it's done in Arkansas or Alabama. I think California is moving to make him even renaming what they call the Department of Corrections, and they have arts programming in prisons. Not saying that's the greatest thing or most transformative thing on earth, but I'd rather be in a prison in California than anywhere in jail or incarcerated anywhere in Alabama. So this varies widely. I hope I gave you a really complicated answer, because it's really, that's a way complicated question, but it's a good question.
Thank you for that. There's lots of questions here, so I'm just, yeah, trying. We'll see how. I hope we can get through them all, but please keep them coming. We have another question that says, you mentioned the divide between theorizing and conceptualizing the carceral system between rural and urban contexts. Could you speak on how scholars might work to bridge that gap? How does the urban-centric focus on larger cities detract from work done in the rural South, or even on a larger national goal of abolition?
So the urban center focus really, we have, it's not just, I shouldn't just say it's urban center focus. It's really like the limousine liberals, right? And I know I get constant flack for this, but the part of the presentation I was gonna show today before I went to COVID was demonstrating how punishment is purple. So it means it's not red or blue, it's both. And conservative Democrats, we're a conservative nation. We love punishment, especially in the South. So when we have this, and we not only love to punish people, we love to benefit from punishment. That's the other part of this. And that's part of what I was demonstrating. Even Black people who understood that we're disproportionately incarcerated were for the prison, right? They wanted a prison in that town. I don't believe that's just happening in Forest City, Arkansas, which is named after the founder of the KKK, by the way, Nathan Bedford Forrest. I think this is something we have to struggle with. And this is a limousine liberal viewpoint where we just say prisons are bad. They're racist and economically, they're based in racism and economic exploitation. Nobody can deny that, but it's not like white people don't go to prison too. And it's not like Black people don't want prisons and Black people don't work for the prison system. I'm doing, for this book, I've actually done some calculations around the probability of a Black person knowing someone who's either a police officer or corrections officer. And given the fact that 12% of the more than 900,000 sworn officers in this country are Black, and like I said earlier, 35% of the 470,000 corrections officers are Black. Basically, 1 out of every 2 Black people in this country knows someone who's benefiting directly, who is paid as a police officer or corrections officer. And we don't think about this urban-centered view doesn't allow us to even understand race and rurality and region. We have a very limited like bridge and tunnel. These are the people, the thought leaders on this are sort of, they look down on the bridge and tunnel folks in New York, right? I'm speaking at Yale. I know this audience, you guys know like the Manhattanites, how you look down, how there's a fair number of people who may even live in Manhattan who, you know, talk about bridge and tunnel folks. And we're in, when I'm talking about Forest City, that's so far in the sticks, it doesn't even exist as a reality for many people who are thought leaders around mass incarceration. So this is a completely different perspective because I spent a year with my family in Forest City. So I'm trying to tell that perspective and use the empirical reality, not just quantitative, but the empirical reality, meaning qualitative, historical, and the like, that exists from that perspective. So we need to change our perspective to understand this phenomena. And that's what I'm arguing for.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. Another question is about how the local government in New Mexico is pushing back against the state government telling them to close a prison, and how this, is an example of the failure of government to provide economic opportunities that, and so what do we replace prisons with, and how do we create these opportunities when there's so much dependence?
Yeah, so along with that, there's actually a study, a political scientist, Becca Thorpe, shows how towns that have prisons oppose legislation that will reduce our over-reliance on mass incarceration. So there's Heather Schoenfeld shows this in Florida too. There was a Black state legislator who was fighting to keep a Black Democratic state legislator who was beefing with a white Republican legislator about keeping a prison, right? So this isn't just in this. So the question is, it's not just in New Mexico. This is something we're going to contend with. And I think we really have to focus on offering alternative economies. So the infrastructure plan that Biden just came out with, I think is a good start, but it really needs to be expanded. Our rural communities are lagging way behind in terms of infrastructure and development. We also need to give them other options. So I know that AOC is a lightning rod, and even saying the Green New Deal can be problematic for some folks, right? But we need to think about, I don't care what you call it, it has to be a set of policies that focuses on rural communities, and we need alternative industries. And I think the green industry, even focusing on selling the growing and distribution of marijuana out of rural communities. I know a lot of Southern communities have laws on the books against hemp, not just marijuana, but we have to present these the new world economy to rural communities as an alternative, because you can't just tell them no to prisons. That's part of this limousine liberal phenomena. You have to give them something. So this is a great question. And I'm thinking about this right now as I write this book. The last chapter of the book is called Bringing Down the Big House. So offering alternatives to rural communities as a way to close prisons is what I'm really thinking through right now. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. We have another question that kind of piggybacks off of that, with asking about your thoughts on prison abolition in general, and what, like, for example, like, would you change it to a rehabilitation center, like in Scandinavian countries, or what? Like, what is the?
I think everything is on the table. I mean, I was literally, when I finished my book in like 2015, my book was finished in 2014 or 2015. It didn't come out till 2017. Anybody that's still, I love you, Chicago Press. I'm probably have to go back with them for my second book, but it, this, like, I was depressed because I looked at, we had built 1,100 plus facilities in 35 years. How do you come back from that, right? And so it was really sobering just to start thinking, like, how do we come back from this? And we built these across 50 states, more than 3,000 counties, and 2,700 municipalities, right? So they're concentrated, though, prisons and jails, or even immigrant detention centers, which I also study. If you want to come back from this, these fights are all local. So here in Dane County, I did this data use agreement to show them the policies they enacted. They're reduced, and within a month, they dropped the jail population by 30%. Bam. This was a coordinated effort by the Dane County Criminal Justice Council. And they did this, bam, like within 30 days, the prison population had dropped. So I was like, okay, what did you all do? And they've had several meetings about this. And then I said, well, why can't you keep doing it? Right? Because they have to build a new jail. And local prison abolitionists are saying, don't build a new jail. The issue is their jail is so dangerous that people can murder, they can murder other folks and or commit suicide, because there's these dead spaces that exist in really dangerous conditions. So they have to build a new jail. Because they've decarcerated so much, there's a new sheriff coming in. Instead of making it 20 beds less, there's a potential to send it back to the architects to make it over 100 beds less. And for a place that houses 700 to 800 people, if you get a jail that goes down to 600 people, that's a win, right? This is how we start to chip away at mass incarceration. It's just a bunch of local fights. It's probably, we won't get down to rates. I don't see us getting down to like 1 million. There's a Cut 50 campaign. If we could get down to 1 million people in 30 years, that would be incredible, but it's going to be just a series of local fights. I'm more hopeful, but I think it's a huge push to reverse. It's like turning around the Titanic. You know, how do you built something this big, 1,600 plus facilities. How do you all of a sudden go bam and shut them all down, right? With no consequences.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have another question about whether or not your work's done on whether or not the prisons actually do provide the economic benefits that they've provided to their prison sites.
Yes, they do. And I have a paper called Prisons as Panacea and Pariah. I'll just reference you to that. That is a conservative estimate. And I even had to say that the effects aren't that long lasting. But for those of you who are in the measurement and modeling quantitative methods, I have 4 different dependent variables. I use 3 different analyses for a robustness check. The other papers that have been published on this topic use very problematic data. I've spent over $100,000 to clean the data to get the most extensive population of prisons. They also don't compare like with like. They don't compare places that are most likely to get prisons with places that actually get prisons. So when I do all of that, in my analysis, I showed that prisons decrease unemployment and poverty. They also increase median home value and median family income. And that's with a 2-year lag. I'm measuring 2 years after the prison opens. I could actually measure 2 to 5 years ahead of the prison opening, as my ethnography would suggest, because for a city started seeing benefits before their prison opened. Right. So that was with a 2-year lag on every prison built across multiple decades. So yes, prisons do benefit places, and they do benefit Black people who live in those places. Right. It's not this cut and dry winner or loser. It's who wins and how do they win. Those Black folks I showed you on the screen earlier were all winners. They all won. They got minority set aside contracts, and they all saw a windfall once the prison came. So with that in mind, that makes it difficult, right? We do that. That means we really have to offer them something else to get them off of prisons. Great question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that, let's see, there's one last question here. I think we have time for one more question about how do you, and it also goes off with what you were just talking about with how can we use research models comparing cost benefit services for incarceration versus like mental health, you know, the cost benefit of like mental health resources, substance abuse treatment. If there's a way to compare, you know, building those resources versus prisons.
Oh, so yeah, so once again, there's this popular discourse around rural communities have chosen to get prisons instead of hospitals. I don't know if that's an empirical reality. There's the in I actually think if you test this out, because we have healthcare organizations, healthcare HCO data, and we can look at whether or not in a rural county they have a hospital, right? And we can model whether or not you get whether towns with who already have hospitals are more likely to build prisons, or towns with prisons are more likely to build hospitals. I don't think it's an either or. I think that's part of this, again, this northern urban centered bias. Rural places are backwards and make bad choices, right? I think that question comes out of that, because there's this popular notion of how they're making choices between how actually, that's one of the many questions I can answer with the data that I've spent, the last 20 years building. So yeah, that's a good question. I think it needs to be, it's a question that needs to be answered empirically, right? To see if healthcare organizations offset some of what we think is happening with prisons, right? So you should also understand that prisons aren't themselves a bad thing. They aren't, right? The empirics say that. Do I support prison building? No. In fact, I'm against prison building. I'd like to see more prisons closed, but we need to understand that prison building acts in a way to ballast communities. So I think if they're in doing the analysis, I suspect that places that have more social capital and more community, more organizational density in the form of healthcare organizations, especially hospitals, would be more likely to get a prison, because whoever's working at the hospital can also moonlight at the prison. It's part of the issue that people don't, the political economy of these places, and taking the southern rural perspective, or just taking a rural perspective and understanding the options, and not only limited options, but also what's in these communities, can help us rework those questions to see what the empirical reality is. Instead of just saying, we're shutting it down, it's all terrible, then you're not speaking to the people who have something to lose on this. And it's not just the rich people who own everything in the town. Prisons reduce poverty. When you build a prison in the town, it reduces the poverty line. Thank you. That's a great question as well. Sorry, I went a little over.
No, you're good. So thank you so much for your talk. It's been wonderful and very fascinating and interesting. I'd just like to point out for everyone right before we end that we have in the chat the link to register for the last spring seminar, which will be with Dr. Elizabeth Barnett, Assistant Professor at UCLA, entitled Youth Justice and Health in the United States. That's on May 20th at 4 p.m. So be sure to register for that one. Thank you so much, Dr. Eason, for your presentation, and thank you everyone here